Happening now, the last ships from China bringing cargo unaffected by President Trump's massive new tariffs are sailing into American ports. So that means
in early 2025, the world faced an event that changed the usual rules of the global economy. The decision to introduce large-scale tariffs was the spark that triggered a chain reaction affecting millions of people and entire industries. The policy, designed to protect American manufacturers, unexpectedly hit the largest player in global trade, Amazon.
Higher tariff of 145%, but I should note there will be fewer ships and less cargo because it is simply...
Imagine this: you go to a website to buy a regular product, a laptop, a jacket, or a children's toy, and suddenly notice that the price has gone up, not because of inflation or corporate greed, but because the goods are caught in new trade barriers. Thus began the story of the biggest supply chain restructuring of the 21st century.
Or do they choose not to bring that product in? And that is where you can wind up with a situation of shortages. Now, JP Morgan is projecting that they expect a 75 to 80% drop.
Tariffs of 10% on all imported goods and a shocking 145% on products from China were a blow that could not go unnoticed. For small companies, this resulted in bankruptcies, but for Amazon, it became a matter of survival. The company, which accounted for almost half of all online commerce in the United States, found itself threatened with the destruction of its own business model, built on low prices and highly efficient logistics. But instead of giving up, Amazon did what few expected. In a matter of weeks, the corporation reallocated more than $13 billion to new contracts and began a global restructuring of its entire infrastructure. Chinese factories, which for decades were considered the center of global manufacturing, lost a key customer. Their place was taken by Mexico, India, and Vietnam. Where yesterday there were empty warehouses and unfinished factories, today new hubs of global trade have emerged.
And electronics from China than any other country. And Pamela, I have spoken to retailers and supply chain economists about whether or not they can reposition to manufacture in other countries and then bring that product in from those countries.
This restructuring not only saved Amazon, but also changed the map of the global economy. American ports such as Los Angeles and Long Beach faced a drop in cargo turnover of tens of percent. For thousands of workers, this meant a loss of hours, income, and confidence in the future. At the same time, new factories were being built in Mexican and Vietnamese cities, jobs were being created, and long-term investments were appearing in Indian technology hubs. But ordinary consumers felt the change the most. Electronics became tens of percent more expensive, clothing and household items became less affordable, and delivery times increased. For millions of families, this resulted in additional expenses of hundreds and thousands of dollars per year. It was not corporations or governments that paid, it was people. The main irony is that tariffs designed to strengthen the US economy actually accelerated its decline. Instead of bringing manufacturing back to the US, we saw other countries strengthen their position, ready to quickly fill the void. And although Amazon proved that it could adapt to even the most radical challenges, the result was paradoxical. Globalization did not stop, it simply changed routes.
In imports from China this year because of these higher tariffs, especially around back-to-school items and holiday items, because Pamela...
Today we will discuss how the company managed to survive, what steps it took, and what these changes mean for each of us. After all, the story of Amazon is not just a business case study. It is a lesson in how a single political decision can upset the balance of power in the global economy and change the future of millions of people. In early 2025, processes began in the US economy that many had previously considered impossible. The new wave of tariffs announced by Donald Trump's administration was an event that instantly changed the familiar landscape of world trade. These were not isolated measures or symbolic gestures in the spirit of previous trade wars, but a full-scale attack on import chains. The basic tariff of 10% applied to virtually all goods crossing the US border, but the real blow was the 145% duty on products from China. For an economy that had been tied to Chinese manufacturing for decades, it looked like shock therapy.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
In the first weeks after the policy was announced, analysts argued about its consequences. Some claimed that it would lead to the rapid return of factories to America, while others spoke of chaos that would undermine confidence in the US as a trading partner. But regardless of the forecast, one thing was clear to everyone: the largest corporations operating in global markets would not be able to avoid the blow. This was especially true for Amazon, a company that by that point controlled about 40% of all online commerce in the United States. Amazon found itself at the epicenter of the crisis. Its business model had always been based on low prices and refined logistics, where every minute of delivery and every cent of cost mattered. But the new tariffs knocked the foundation out from under this model. Overnight, electronics, clothing, household appliances, and even the simplest goods such as kitchen utensils found themselves in the luxury category. Research showed that the average cost of laptops had risen by 25%, smartphones by 30%, and household goods by 15 to 20%. For millions of consumers, this was the first sign that something had changed.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Panic set in within the company. According to journalists, several key Amazon management meetings lasted until dawn. The company's economists calculated that if Amazon decided to pass on the new costs entirely to customers, prices on the site would skyrocket, threatening its competitiveness. If it tried to absorb the costs, annual losses would exceed $40 billion. In either scenario, it meant the collapse of the familiar model. Against this backdrop, leaks began to appear in the media about telephone conversations between the White House and Jeff Bezos. According to sources, the president was unhappy with reports that Amazon was going to display the cost of tariffs in the customer's shopping cart, directly pointing to government policy as the reason for the price increase. This move was interpreted as a challenge, and although there is no official confirmation, the very possibility of such a conflict added to the tension. Outwardly, the situation looked like a purely economic problem, but in reality, it took on a political tone. Some commentators called Amazon's actions an act of resistance, while others called them a desperate attempt to save the business from disaster. Added to this were rumors that the company was even discussing plans to partially withdraw from the US market and refocus on Europe and Asia. Amazon representatives later denied these discussions, but the very fact that such versions appeared in the information field reinforced the impression of instability.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
And then came April 2025. That's when Amazon announced a massive supply chain overhaul, for which the company allocated over $13 billion. This decision was a turning point. Within a few weeks, Amazon terminated or revised dozens of contracts with Chinese factories and shipping companies that had been the foundation of its success for many years. The company began urgently signing new agreements with manufacturers in Mexico, India, and Vietnam. These regions were previously considered secondary, but now found themselves at the center of the strategy. In the first months of 2025, projects were announced in Mexico to build 5 large warehouse complexes in border areas, as well as plans to double the fleet of trucks crossing the border with the United States. In Vietnam, Amazon signed agreements with electronics and textile manufacturers, while India became the main destination for the transfer of production of household appliances and digital devices.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
This move looked like a bold attempt to circumvent tariff barriers, but the restructuring turned out to be not only large-scale, but also risky. According to rumors, there was even talk within the company of temporarily slowing down delivery speeds to the US in order to buy time to reconfigure logistics. As a result, delivery times did increase, albeit not by much. Customers began to complain that the usual 2 days had turned into 3 or 4, and sometimes even a week. At the same time, Amazon invested billions in upgrading its digital infrastructure, artificial intelligence systems, previously configured to forecast deliveries from China, were urgently rewritten to take into account new routes from India and Vietnam. Even pricing algorithms had to be reconfigured. Now it was necessary to take into account cheaper labor in Mexico, but at the same time expensive car delivery across the United States. These changes were invisible to buyers, but critical to the company's survival. Against the backdrop of these events, the first consequences for the American economy began to emerge. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which had been gateways for Chinese cargo for decades, faced a sharp drop in volume. By mid-2025, cargo turnover had fallen by 20%, which meant thousands of lost jobs. At the same time, northern Mexico was experiencing a real economic boom. New businesses were opening in the cities of Monterrey and Tijuana, employment was rising, and local authorities were reporting unprecedented tax revenues.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The paradox was that measures aimed at strengthening the US economy had led to the exact opposite result. Amazon, in saving itself, had simultaneously stimulated the growth of competitors outside the US. India and Vietnam gained new jobs and investment, while Mexico strengthened its role in North American logistics. The US, meanwhile, faced rising prices, falling employment in transportation and trade, and consumer disappointment. Thus, the first two stages of this story, the introduction of tariffs and Amazon's response, were only the beginning of a deeper transformation. On the one hand, we saw how a single government decision could literally destroy the familiar mechanisms of global trade in a matter of months. On the other hand, we saw how a corporation with resources and flexibility could reshape global processes to suit itself, even at the cost of upheaval for millions of people. And although many experts said that the crisis would stabilize sooner or later, by mid-2025 it was clear that the world as we knew it no longer existed. Amazon began to redraw the map of globalization, and this process was irreversible.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
When Amazon announced a major restructuring of its supply chains, reality changed not only for the company itself, but for entire regions. China, which for decades had been the world's factory and the main supplier for the American online retailer, found itself on the sidelines of the new logistics map. In a matter of weeks, hundreds of contracts that previously linked Chinese factories to American consumers ceased to exist. This caused a domino effect. Thousands of containers that were supposed to be shipped to the US remained in warehouses. Ports in southern China reported a 35% drop in activity, and some manufacturers were forced to freeze production. But other players immediately began to fill the void in the global system. Mexico became the main beneficiary of Amazon's new strategy. During the first half of 2025, a construction boom began in the border areas of this country. Warehouses, logistics hubs, and even new industrial parks sprang up on former vacant lots. According to local authorities, Amazon's investments alone exceeded $5 billion in 8 months. New distribution centers appeared in Monterrey and Tijuana, which not only served the US market but also began to play a role in regional deliveries throughout Latin America. By the fall, the flow of trucks crossing the border had increased by 60%, and queues at border crossings reached 20 kilometers. The American media published reports about drivers who spent 2 days in queues waiting to enter Texas or Arizona. Vietnam, until recently considered a minor manufacturing hub, experienced a real industrial boom. Factories in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City began operating in 3 shifts to meet the demand from Amazon and its partners. The production of electronics and clothing grew particularly strongly. According to economists, Vietnam's exports to the US will increase by 45% by the end of 2025. The country has faced unexpected difficulties. A shortage of skilled workers, power outages, and traffic jams have become everyday problems. To compensate for this, Amazon invested in modernizing port infrastructure and introducing new digital systems for managing the flow of goods.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
India, with its huge population and rapidly developing infrastructure, has become another strategic direction. Here, Amazon did not limit itself to contracts with manufacturers. The company began actively building new warehouse complexes and order processing centers, investing billions in logistics development. Tens of thousands of jobs were created in Indian cities, and local authorities reported an increase in tax revenues and rapid development of the transport network. According to some data, as a result of these steps, India was able to overtake China in terms of the volume of supplies of certain categories of goods to the US, such as textiles and small household appliances. But against the backdrop of this dynamic, the American economy began to feel the opposite effect. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which had previously been symbols of US power in world trade, began to empty. The decline in cargo turnover reached a record 25% by the end of 2025. This meant that thousands of port workers lost their shifts or lost their jobs altogether. There were reports of layoffs at companies serving maritime transport, the closure of small transport businesses and restaurants and shops linked to port infrastructure also being hit hard. American logistics, which had been geared toward imports from Asia for decades, suddenly found itself underutilized. Transport companies reported a 30 to 40% drop in orders. Truck drivers, who previously spent weeks on routes from ports to the central states, now complained about the lack of stable work. Airports dependent on urgent deliveries recorded a drop in cargo traffic.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
At the same time, pressure on consumers was growing. Even despite all of Amazon's efforts to reorient its deliveries, it was unable to avoid price increases. By the end of the year, the cost of electronics had risen by an average of 18%, household appliances by 15%, and clothing and footwear by 12%. For Americans, accustomed to affordable prices and fast delivery, this came as a shock. The average family spent $1,500 more per year on basic purchases than before. Sociologists noted a rise in discontent. About 60% of respondents said that the new tariffs had worsened their personal financial situation. The retail sector began to experience difficulties. Walmart reported double-digit increases in purchase prices, which threatened its everyday low prices strategy. Target and Home Depot also reported supply disruptions and rising costs. Industries tied to seasonal demand were particularly hard hit. In the run-up to Christmas, toy companies did not have time to set up new production chains, and popular goods were in short supply. The media published images of empty shelves, creating a symbolic image of the crisis. But it wasn't just large corporations that felt the impact. Small businesses involved in reselling goods through Amazon and other online platforms found themselves in an even more difficult position. Many entrepreneurs who depended on Chinese suppliers were unable to adapt and were forced to close. According to independent analysts, by the end of 2025, about 15% of small U.S. retail companies will have ceased operations due to rising costs and falling demand.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher, 16% currently.
These processes showed a contrast. What brought growth in some countries caused a crisis in others. While Indian and Vietnamese cities were expanding and Mexican logistics companies were announcing record profits, U.S. regions dependent on trade were cutting their budgets. In California, several municipalities reported a 10 to 12% drop in tax revenues, which meant cuts in funding for schools and public programs. The situation seemed paradoxical. Policies designed to strengthen the American economy were actually having the opposite effect, increasing employment and income outside the US and eroding America's position. And although Amazon managed to adapt and maintain control over its platform, the scale of the restructuring only highlighted how deeply integrated modern trade is. and how vulnerable national economies are to the decisions of large corporations.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
By the end of 2025, it became clear that the consequences of this restructuring would be felt for a long time to come. For some regions, it marked the beginning of a new era of growth, while for others, it symbolized missed opportunities. In its quest to strengthen the domestic market, the US was confronted with a painful reality. Globalization is not disappearing, it is merely changing direction. And it was Amazon, which bet on a sharp reorientation, that became a symbol of this new reality, in which the winners were not American workers, but countries that were able to take up the challenge in time and fill the vacant space.